I'm gonna have to ask you to step out of the line." Words snapped across the boarding area like a whip, freezing Simone Carter mid-stride. She had barely crossed the velvet rope into the first-class priority lane when the security officer's hand landed on her forearm, not rough, but firm enough to send a message. Around her, the flow of passengers continued without interruption. Businessmen in tailored suits, retirees clutching vacation totes, teenagers in sweatshirts plastered with Ivy League logos. They passed through, unchecked, unquestioned. Only Simone was stopped. Only Simone was singled out. She turned slowly, meeting the officer's eyes with a calmness that masked the flicker of cold fury rising in her chest. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice smooth, measured. The officer, whose name tag read Brandon Pierce, didn't blink. "Random security check," he said mechanically, though the randomness was belied by the ease with which he ignored the stream of white passengers boarding behind her. He motioned her aside, directing her to a low-walled holding area off to the side of the gate. No explanation, no verification of boarding passes, just an assumption wrapped in the thin veneer of authority. Simone stepped aside, keeping her movements deliberate, refusing to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. She was used to this choreography, used to the way systems found ways to remind her that no matter how high she climbed, no matter how flawless her credentials, they would always look for reasons to pull her back down. As Brandon ran a handheld scanner perfunctorily over her bag, she caught snippets of murmured conversations. Maybe she was trying to cut the line. Did she even have a ticket? A woman in oversized sunglasses whispered audibly to her husband. You know how they are sometimes. Simone inhaled slowly through her nose, exhaled quietly. She handed over her boarding pass when asked, watching Brandon frown slightly as he scanned it. "First class," he said, almost surprised. Simone said nothing. Her silence was sharper than any retort. He handed the phone back after an unnecessarily long pause, gesturing half-heartedly toward the gate. "You're clear," he said. She walked forward, posture perfect, face unreadable, though her mind burned. She moved with the unshakable grace born of necessity, the kind cultivated by generations who understood that dignity was a weapon as much as a right. As she rejoined the boarding process, now thinned out to a trickle, she felt the residual weight of judgment clinging to her like mist. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant offered a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Simone returned it with a nod and stepped into the first-class cabin, the luxury muted by the low hum of whispered conversation. She made her way towards seat 1A. Her seat, bought and paid for, at full fare. Not points, not an upgrade, not a favor. Hers. But as she approached, she saw that 1A was already occupied. And a middle-aged white man, dressed casually in a navy blazer and khakis, reclined comfortably with a drink in hand, his duffel bag slouched against the wall. His presence wasn't questioned, his entitlement wasn't challenged. Simone paused, heart sinking, but face remaining impassive. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, a woman with frosted blonde hair, who glanced at Simone's boarding pass and then at the man in 1A with a flicker of hesitation. "There must be a mistake," Simone said evenly. "This is my seat." The flight attendant's smile tightened. She consulted her tablet, fingers tapping with an urgency that hinted at the situation's sensitivity. After a beat, she looked up. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, too brightly. "We had a last-minute reassignment. You've been moved to 18C. Simone's hand tightened slightly on the handle of her tote. "I purchased seat 1A, she said, the words precise, stripped of any plea. The flight attendant nodded sympathetically, a performance practiced to a fine sheen. "I understand, but we're fully boarded now. Please proceed to 18C so we can finish preparations for takeoff." There it was. The soft coercion of urgency, the subtle weaponization of inconvenience. Make her the problem. Make her the delay. Simone knew the script too well. Without a word, she accepted the new boarding slip pressed into her hand. The material crinkled slightly under her fingers as she turned and walked the long, narrow aisle back to economy class. Past rows of wide leather seats she had rightfully claimed. Past gazes that slid over her, assessing, dismissing. She reached 18C, a cramped middle seat between a teenager tapping furiously on a handheld game console and an elderly woman who looked up at Simone's approach with polite confusion. Simone stowed her tote, buckled her seatbelt, and folded her hands in her lap. Her breathing was steady, her heartbeat was slow. Outwardly, she was the picture of acceptance. But inside, something colder than anger was taking shape. Something strategic. Because what none of them realized, what Brandon Pierce, the flight attendant, the gate agents, and the man now sipping champagne in her seat didn't know, was that Simone Carter wasn't just another inconvenienced passenger. She was the financial architect behind the $4 billion zero-cents merger that would decide this airline's future. And she was about to teach them a lesson about turbulence they would never forget. They thought downgrading her seat would be the end of the story, but what happens when the woman they dismissed controls the fate of their entire airline? The seat in 18C was every bit as cramped as Simone had expected. The tray table stuck slightly when she tried to lower it. The overhead air vent refused to turn without a screech. Still, she moved with careful precision, settling herself as though she were still in seat 1A, surrounded by polished mahogany and silver trim. Power wasn't about where you sat, it was about how you sat there. And Simone Carter had never forgotten that. Around her, the energy of the cabin was different. There was no muted hush of first class, no flight attendants offering champagne before takeoff. Here, the air was heavier with impatience, elbows jostling for space, murmured frustrations about overhead bins and delayed connections. A man across the aisle kept sneaking glances at her, his brows furrowed slightly, as if trying to place her, to make sense of her. Maybe he assumed she had somehow wandered up from coach by accident. Maybe he assumed she didn't belong. Assumptions were cheap, and Simone had grown used to being their target. The teenager next to her turned up the volume on his handheld game, the tinny sounds of explosions leaking through cheap earbuds. The elderly woman on the other side shifted uncomfortably, stealing quick looks at Simone, as if measuring the distance between them, as if trying to decide whether proximity itself was some kind of inconvenience. Simone folded her hands neatly in her lap and stared straight ahead. She thought about how easily narratives attach themselves, how a black woman in first class was assumed to be a mistake, how the presence of dignity in the wrong skin could trigger scrutiny before words were even exchanged. She thought about the security officer who hadn't asked to see her ticket before pulling her out of line, about the flight attendant who hadn't questioned why seat 1A had been reassigned without her consent, about the passengers who watched it happen and decided they didn't need to know the details to assume guilt. None of them had asked her name. None of them had imagined she might be someone whose influence stretched far beyond the square footage of a single airplane seat. The plane taxied down the runway. Simone closed her eyes briefly, feeling the rumble beneath her feet, the mechanical shudder as wheels left Earth. She had spent her life building lift under circumstances designed to weigh her down. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. It was simply familiar. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, the flight attendants moved down the aisle with service carts distributing small plastic cups of soda and packets of pretzels. In first class, they would already be unwrapping plated meals, offering warmed rolls and fresh-cut fruit. Simone received a lukewarm ginger ale, the cup cracked slightly along the rim. She accepted it without comment. Power was never in the theater. Power was in patience. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Simone reached into her tote and pulled out her tablet. She tapped through secure files, reviewing the updated merger documents for Quasar Capital and Skyrise Airlines, the very airline she was currently flying with. Lines of financial statements, contractual obligations, and regulatory compliance reports glowed on the screen. She scrolled past the public relations memos, the brand positioning strategies that touted Skyrise as a new era of inclusive travel. She smiled, the expression dry, almost bitter. Inclusivity, it seemed, was easier to market than to practice. She opened a fresh document and began making notes, not angry notes, surgical ones. She highlighted areas where funding could be delayed, clauses where regulatory filings could be challenged. She made a list of public-facing corrective actions that could be required if the merger was to proceed with Quasar's endorsement. Training overhauls, independent audits, leadership restructuring. Every indignity they thought they could slip past her would now cost them millions to unwind. A small turbulence bump rattled the overhead bins. Simone didn't even blink. Across the cabin, a flight attendant approached with another tray. She smiled warmly at the couple 2 rows ahead, chatting as she handed over drinks. When she reached Simone's row, her expression cooled by a few degrees, the smile dropping into something practiced and perfunctory. "Snack?" she asked, almost tossing the packet into Simone's lap. Simone caught it neatly, without looking up. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply added another invisible mark to her mental ledger. Because Simone Carter wasn't collecting apologies. She was collecting evidence. The plane cruised through cloud cover, a silver streak across a bruised sky. Simone sat still, the flicker of her tablet's screen illuminating the crisp edges of a plan already forming, already solidifying into the inevitable. The weight of their assumptions hung heavy in the air, but they weren't Simone's burden to carry. They were about to become their own undoing. They assumed she would absorb the insult quietly, but what happens when the woman you try to erase is the one rewriting the rules? The flight dragged on in that strange, compressed way that only long-distance air travel can manage, a slow bleed of time measured by meal trays and cabin announcements. Simone Carter remained still in her seat at 18C, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind sharper than the steel wings slicing through the clouds outside. Around her, passengers shifted restlessly, reclined seats with audible clicks, queued for the lavatory with weary faces. Flight attendants made their rounds again, this time offering warmed towels to the first-class passengers. The passengers who had stepped onto the plane, without question, without interruption, without humiliation. The rows in economy received nothing, not even a second glance. Simone felt no anger as she watched this subtle distribution of dignity, only confirmation, evidence stacking itself quietly, meticulously, until even the most carefully curated narratives about fairness and service would collapse under their own weight. She reached down for her tote, extracting a slim black notebook she always carried, not for work notes or schedules, those lived on encrypted devices, but for moments like this, moments when memory wasn't enough, moments that needed to be archived in ink. She opened to a fresh page and began to write, the pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Gate security intervention without cause, boarding reassignment without notice, disparate treatment in service interactions, no acknowledgement of inconvenience, no escalation offered. Each line was clinical, emotionless. She didn't need to editorialize. The facts were indictment enough. As the plane began its slow descent toward LaGuardia, Simone closed her notebook and tucked it away. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer with slow, deliberate motions. Her power was not in retaliation. It was in patience, in documentation, in the strategic application of truth at precisely the right moment. When the wheels touched down with a lurch, a few passengers clapped half-heartedly. Simone remained silent. The cabin lights blinked on with a sterile hum. Passengers around her sprang into motion, unbuckling seatbelts, yanking down bags, jostling for position in the aisle. Simone stayed seated, allowing the tide of impatience to flow past her. She understood timing. She understood leverage. The young man with the game console bumped her elbow as he tried to wrestle his backpack free from under the seat. He mumbled a distracted apology without looking at her. The elderly woman beside her offered a tight, non-committal smile. It didn't matter. Their assumptions weren't her concern. Their perceptions weren't her problem. When the aisle cleared enough for her to stand, Simone rose with the same grace she had carried into countless boardrooms. Countless hostile negotiations where men twice her age and half her competence had tried to diminish her and failed. She retrieved her tote, slinging it over her shoulder with a practiced motion, and made her way slowly down the aisle toward the front of the plane. At the threshold between economy and first class, she paused, not to cause a scene, not to claim a space that had been denied to her, but simply to look to see the physical manifestation of a system that still measured worth by old, rotten metrics. Skin, gender, assumptions carved deeper than any welcome speech could sand smooth. The man who had taken her seat in 1A was still lounging comfortably, sipping another drink, laughing at something the flight attendant whispered to him. He didn't even notice Simone as she passed. He didn't have to. His comfort was rooted in a certainty she would never share. The certainty of belonging that had never needed to be earned. Simone let the moment settle into her bones, not bitterness but clarity. Outside the gate, the airport bustled with the chaotic efficiency of a city too large to care about individual stories. Simone navigated through it with ease, moving past kiosks and families clustered around luggage piles. She could have gone straight to the hotel, could have buried the day in meetings and memos and the next project on her docket. But instead she stopped. She found a quiet corner near a bank of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, where planes taxied like slow, lumbering giants. She pulled out her phone and opened a secure messaging app, typing out a simple directive to her second-in-command at Quasar Capital. Initiate full compliance audit on Skyrise Airlines, authorization Carter Direct, immediate priority. The reply came within seconds, confirmed, preliminary reports within 48 hours. Simone locked her phone and slid it back into her tote. She stood there a moment longer, watching the planes move in slow procession against the setting sun. Dignity wasn't a favor. Respect wasn't optional. And if this industry needed reminding of that truth, Simone Carter was prepared to etch it into every line item of their balance sheets until they never forgot again. Because silent dignity wasn't weakness. It was the storm you never saw coming until the ground shook beneath your feet. They mistook her silence for surrender. But what happens when the woman they tried to ignore now holds the power to dismantle everything they built? Simone Carter didn't need to slam doors or raise her voice to shift the course of an empire. She had built her career on understanding that real power moved quietly, reshaping foundations long before anyone heard the cracks. As she rode in the back seat of the black town car weaving through New York traffic, she reviewed the files on her tablet. Each document a thread connected to Skyrise Airlines, each number a piece of the noose tightening around their future. By the time the driver pulled up to Quasar Capital's downtown headquarters, Simone had already mapped out the first stages of what needed to happen. Inside the gleaming glass tower, the rhythm of high finance pulsed steadily. Analysts buried in spreadsheets, executives pacing with Bluetooth earpieces, assistants hustling between meetings. But when Simone stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, conversations hushed mid-sentence. Heads turned. She didn't have to announce her arrival. Her presence did that for her. Waiting in her office was Ava Sinclair, her chief strategy officer, already pulling up reports as Simone entered. "We received preliminary findings on Skyrise," Ava said without preamble. "Multiple internal complaints about discrimination patterns, settlements paid out quietly, training programs implemented for optics, but no measurable reform. They look clean on paper, but dig 2 layers deep and it's a mess." Simone set her tote down carefully and slid into her chair. Good. Push the internal compliance audit to external review status. Make it public that Quasar is reassessing our strategic partnership. Ava hesitated only a moment. That's going to tank their valuation ahead of the merger. Simone's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Then they should have thought about that before redefining my seat assignment. Outside the windows, the city stretched, endless and glittering. Deals made and broken, fortunes shifted, reputations built over decades dismantled in weeks. Simone understood the game better than anyone. And today, she wasn't just playing, she was flipping the board. She drafted a formal memo to Quasar's board of directors, laying out the recommendation to freeze all pending financial support for Skyrise until full equity audits could be completed and remedial actions verified. It wasn't just a funding freeze. It was a signal to the entire market that Skyrise was radioactive until further notice. Within an hour, the memo leaked, strategically, intentionally, to a select group of reporters who specialized in transportation and finance beats. Headlines began to surface quietly across industry newsletters and financial wires. Quasar reevaluates $4.00. B. Skyrise merger after compliance concerns. Investor forums lit up with speculation. Stock analysts downgraded Skyrise's outlook before the market even closed. The ripple effect was immediate. At Skyrise headquarters, phones rang off the hook. Lawyers scrambled to understand what had changed. Public relations drafted tentative statements about our continued commitment to diversity that no one believed. Senior executives huddled in conference rooms, piecing together fragments of rumors, until some brave junior staffer finally connected the dots. It wasn't a general market shift. It wasn't regulatory uncertainty. It was her, Simone Carter, the woman they had pulled from first class without so much as checking her name. The woman whose signature controlled the $4 billion 0-cents pipeline they desperately needed. The realization hit them harder than any public scandal could have. Because this wasn't anger broadcast on social media, this was structural, strategic, silent, and devastating. Simone sat back in her chair, arms folded loosely across her chest, and watched the first reports filter in. Skyrise's stock dropped 3% before the bell. Industry blogs speculated whether Quasar would pull out entirely, setting off a chain reaction that could collapse Skyrise's ambitious expansion plans. But she wasn't finished. She pulled up a secondary file, one outlining the diversity standards Quasar required for all merger candidates, standards Skyrise had publicly agreed to but privately ignored. Simone drafted a demand letter, citing breach of those standards, and formally requesting a meeting with Skyrise's executive leadership to discuss potential corrective measures as a precondition for any continuation of merger talks. The letter was brief, surgical, unassailable, and it made one thing perfectly clear. The future of Skyrise Airlines now sat squarely in the hands of the woman they had dismissed as an inconvenience. As Simone reviewed the final draft, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, not triumph, not revenge, but clarity. They had built walls around opportunity for centuries, disguised as procedures, protocols, traditions. Today, she wasn't knocking on their doors anymore, she was tearing them off their hinges. They thought seating her in economy would make her forget her worth. But what happens when she demands a price they can't afford to pay? Inside Skyrise Airlines' towering headquarters, chaos was blooming like a slow, choking fire. Conference rooms filled with the frantic hum of executives raising their voices over each other, desperate to control a narrative that was already slipping through their fingers. Emergency meetings were scheduled and rescheduled, crisis teams activated. Outside PR firms called in at triple their usual fees, yet none of their frantic motions could touch the core of the disaster, unfolding at a pace they couldn't manage. At the heart of it all sat the $4 billion 0-cents merger with Quasar Capital, now frozen under the cold gaze of Simone Carter's audit. No amount of spin could erase the fact that a single woman had triggered a financial and reputational earthquake with the precision of a scalpel. In the main boardroom on the 47th floor, CEO Richard Vance stood at the head of a long mahogany table, glaring down at the anxious faces of his executive team. "How did we let this happen?" he barked, slamming a palm onto the polished surface. No one answered immediately. They all knew the truth, even if no one dared say it aloud. They hadn't seen her. Not really. They had seen her skin, her silence, her refusal to cause a scene, and dismissed her as a non-threat. Now Simone Carter's name loomed over every email, every call, every whispered conversation between board members terrified for their stock options. Reports were flooding in, investors pulling back commitments, travel bloggers speculating about deep-rooted discrimination issues at Skyrise, financial analysts downgrading projections by the hour. The brand, once hailed as the model of modern air travel, was hemorrhaging public goodwill faster than any PR campaign could contain. Richard turned to his chief legal officer, a thin man named Douglas Sharp, whose face was visibly sweating under the fluorescent lights. "Options," Richard demanded. Douglas cleared his throat. "We could issue a full public apology, announce a company-wide retraining initiative, make a donation to a prominent diversity organization." His voice trailed off under Richard's glare. She doesn't want an apology, came a voice from further down the table. It was Lydia Park, Senior VP of Investor Relations. Her tone was flat, her face pale. She wants leverage. She already has it. The room went still. Then what does she want? Richard snapped. Lydia licked her lips before answering. Control. The word hung in the air, heavier than the tension. Control over the narrative. Control over the standards by which Skyrise would now be judged. Control over whether they survived this merger or crumbled before a woman they had dared to underestimate. Richard shoved away from the table, pacing to the wide windows overlooking the city. Below, traffic crawled through narrow streets, oblivious to the corporate implosion happening dozens of floors above. He whirled back to face his team. We need to meet her demands, whatever they are. There was a collective shifting of bodies, a ripple of unease, because they all knew what that meant. It meant submitting to an audit they couldn't manipulate. It meant overhauling leadership structures, publishing diversity metrics they had long buried in PR fluff. It meant, perhaps worst of all, acknowledging publicly that the problem was not an isolated incident, but systemic. Someone coughed lightly. Someone else muttered something about setting a dangerous precedent. Richard's jaw tightened. Dangerous for whom? Meanwhile, emails poured into their inboxes from Quasar's legal team, each more devastating than the last. Notices of non-compliance, requests for immediate documentation, deadlines attached with the cold efficiency that said, "We are not asking." And overseeing it all, directing it with quiet, lethal accuracy, was Simone Carter. At that exact moment, in her office across the city, Simone reviewed a newly drafted compliance demand letter outlining the conditions for even considering resuming merger negotiations. Independent third-party audits, mandatory leadership resignations, public disclosure of previous discrimination settlements, structural diversity reforms tied to executive compensation. Failure to comply would not simply stall the merger, it would destroy Skyrise's chances of survival in an industry already brutal with competition. She tapped her pen lightly against the desk, reviewing each line for precision. There would be no ambiguity, no loopholes, only accountability. When she was satisfied, she signed her name at the bottom, a signature that had already made grown men sweat and billion-dollar companies scramble to rewrite decades of bad habits. Back at Skyrise, Richard's phone rang. The room fell silent as he snatched it up, put it on speaker. It was Simone's legal counsel. "The terms have been sent," the calm voice announced. "We expect full compliance within 72 hours. Otherwise, Ms. Carter has authorized public withdrawal from the merger, accompanied by a full statement outlining her reasons for doing so." Silence. A total, suffocating silence. Because everyone in that room knew that if Simone Carter walked away, the fallout would not stop at Skyrise. It would ripple through their investors, their partners, their careers. Richard cleared his throat. "We'll review and respond." "You have 72 hours," the voice repeated, then hung up. Richard sagged into his chair. Around him, the empire he thought he controlled crumbled a little further. And somewhere, far above the chaos, Simone Carter simply moved the next piece on the board. They thought compliance would save them, but what happens when survival demands a surrender they aren't ready to give? The executive board at Skyrise Airlines had never moved so quickly or so cautiously. Every call, every internal memo, every emergency session circled back to one unignorable fact. Their survival now rested in the hands of a woman they had once dismissed at a boarding gate. They had 72 hours, but the clock was ticking, louder than their pride could muffle. After long hours of strategy meetings and futile public relations drafts that all rang hollow even to their own ears, Richard Vance and his remaining leadership team agreed on a plan. Face Simone Carter directly. Grovel if necessary. Salvage what they could. Arranging the meeting took effort. Simone did not make it easy. She didn't respond personally to emails. She didn't return desperate voicemails left at her office by Skyrise's legal counsel. It was through Quasar's official channels, an assistant with a voice like carved ice, that the meeting was set. Friday, 11 o'clock IM, at Quasar Capital headquarters. Simone Carter would grant them 1 hour. No second chances. Richard Vance arrived early, flanked by his chief legal officer and the newly installed VP of Diversity Initiatives, a last-minute hire meant to signal commitment, but who had no real power yet. They were shown into a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city skyline, its grandeur somehow making them feel smaller rather than more important. Water bottles sat unopened on the long table. The only sound was the faint hum of central air, a clinical stillness that felt surgical rather than welcoming. At precisely 11 o'clock IM, Simone entered. She didn't stride in with bluster or false grandeur. She simply walked in with the kind of gravity that needed no announcement. Her navy pantsuit was immaculate, her heels silent against the polished floor, her expression carved from stone. She carried no briefcase, no stack of papers, no armor of props. She didn't need them. She was the storm and the silence afterward. Richard stood hastily, offering a hand across the table. "Mr. Carter, thank you for meeting with us," he began, but Simone merely nodded at the chair opposite her and took her seat without touching his hand. A small gesture, but the meaning landed with devastating clarity. When they were seated, Simone spoke first. "You have reviewed the terms," she said, her voice calm and cutting all at once. It wasn't a question, it was an expectation. Richard cleared his throat. "We have, and we're prepared to discuss modification." Simone raised one eyebrow slightly, the barest shift of expression, but it froze Richard mid-sentence. "There are no modifications," she said. "There is compliance or there is collapse." Silence expanded around the table, thick and oppressive. The chief legal officer tried to regain footing. "Ms. Carter, some of these demands, public audits, leadership restructuring, mandatory bias metrics, are aggressive." Simone didn't blink. Aggression was dragging a black woman from a first-class boarding line without checking her name. Aggression was reassigning my paid seat without explanation. Aggression was treating dignity as negotiable. "I assure you, what I am offering is mercy." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but something in Simone's eyes made him think better of it. She continued, her tone steady, almost academic. "You will announce a full independent audit within 10 days. You will publish the findings without redaction. You will terminate executive leadership complicit in settlement cover-ups. You will tie future executive compensation to measurable diversity and inclusion benchmarks, and you will fund a $50 million 0 cents equity initiative, not as charity, but as restitution." The VP of Diversity Initiatives shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Her role here was ornamental at best, and everyone knew it. Richard tried again, softer now. "Ms. Carter, surely there's a way we can collaborate on messaging, frame this as a joint commitment to growth." Simone leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning him to his chair. "You don't get to frame the story. You forfeited that when you framed me as a threat." The air in the room thinned. Finally, Richard slumped back slightly, defeated in the way only a man who had once assumed the world bent to his presence could be. "We accept," he said, hoarsely. Simone offered a tight nod. "I'll expect signed agreements by close of business today. Implementation schedules by end of next week." She rose smoothly, signaling the meeting was over. No handshake, no words of reconciliation. As she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. She didn't look back, but her voice carried easily across the room. "Next time you see a black woman standing where you think she doesn't belong, remember this meeting." And then she was gone. Back across the city, journalists refreshed news feeds, investors recalibrated portfolios, and employees whispered about the rumors swirling through Skyrise's glassed halls. Inside the corporate tower, executives slumped in their seats, staring at the long, hard road ahead, a road paved by the woman they had so casually dismissed. And Simone Carter didn't slow down, because the reckoning wasn't about punishment, it was about recalibration. It was about ensuring that the cost of disrespect was too high to ever risk again. They agreed to her terms to save their company, but could they ever truly rebuild what they allowed to rot? 6 months later, the boarding area at Gate 42 of Skyrise Airline's newly redesigned terminal pulsed with its usual rhythm. Families juggling strollers and juice boxes, solo travelers balancing laptops and lattes, flight attendants lining up for crew callouts. But beneath the surface of ordinary travel chaos, something had shifted. It wasn't in the design of the terminal, though it was newly remodeled. It wasn't in the logo, though the company had undergone a full rebrand. The shift was in the posture, in the pace, in the way the gate agent smiled without suspicion, and the way the woman in the suit jacket no longer had to glance over her shoulder while standing in the first-class line. At the edge of the terminal, partially hidden behind a minimalist sculpture installation, a sleek brass plaque caught the light. The engraving read, "Dignity is not a service, it is a standard." There was no author, no date, but everyone who worked at Skyrise knew where it came from, or rather, who it came from. Simone Carter stood by a wall of windows, watching the reflection of a little black girl walking hand in hand with her mother toward the priority lane. The girl had a backpack shaped like a rocket, and her hair was beaded with silver stars. Her mother walked with the steady composure of someone used to navigating complex spaces, and finally being met with simple respect. The gate agent smiled and greeted them by name. No second glances, no hesitation, just the ease of recognition. Simone watched the mother nod in thanks and guide her daughter forward, the little girl skipping a step ahead. It was small, quiet, but powerful. This was what she'd fought for. Inside the terminal, signs of Skyrise's transformation were everywhere, if you knew what to look for. Complaint kiosks with live, unfiltered dashboards for passengers to submit bias reports anonymously. Flight crew schedules posted with transparency metrics showing progress and representation. Company policy binders now included language on racial equity, with as much emphasis as fuel efficiency and emergency protocol. None of this had existed before Simone sat across from Richard Vance and stripped their empire down to its bones with her silence and her standards. Since then, the overhaul had gone beyond Skyrise. Quasar Capital's Equity Index certification had been picked up by over 120 transportation and hospitality companies across 3 continents. Firms no longer chased funding only with spreadsheets. They brought culture audits, inclusion metrics, and third-party evaluations to the table before even asking about capital. Simone's role had evolved too. She wasn't just Quasar's CFO anymore. She had quietly become the architect of a new funding philosophy, one that measured return not just by profits, but by principle. Her team had doubled in size, built a new division, and embedded policy specialists inside every merger advisory team. CEOs knew, if you wanted the money, your company had to respect people like the one holding the pen. But that wasn't why she was at the terminal today. She was flying, alone. No entourage, no press, no headlines. Just Simone, a leather carry-on, and a seat in 1A she didn't need to justify. She boarded early, not because she needed to assert position, but because the gate agent had looked her in the eye and said, "Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter," like it was a matter of fact, not a matter of awe. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and citrus polish. The attendant offered her water with a real smile, soft, genuine. "Let me know if there's anything you need," she said, not because someone told her to say it, but because she meant it. Simone sat back, fastened her seatbelt, and looked out the window as the ground crew prepared the aircraft. Her tablet buzzed softly. An incoming report from her team? She didn't open it. For once, she didn't need to watch the numbers. They were already in motion. Instead, she thought about the girl at the gate, the way she skipped without fear, the way her mother didn't look around to see who was watching. That was the win. Not the $4 billion, 0 cents, not the headlines, not the policy shifts. It was that a child could walk forward into a space once weaponized against people like her and simply belong. The plane taxied out to the runway, a a slow, smooth roll beneath her feet. Simone placed her palm flat against her armrest, the soft leather warm against her skin. She had once been dragged out of this very seat like a problem needing removal. Now she sat exactly where she'd always belonged, not because someone granted her permission, but because she never stopped claiming it. The engines surged, and the plane lifted, and somewhere above the clouds, she let herself breathe, not to forget what happened, but to remember what it built. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Simone Carter's journey isn't just about one flight or one moment of injustice. It's about the quiet revolution that begins when someone says enough and means it. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've seen it happen. Either way, your voice matters more than ever. So share your thoughts below, speak up, and if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, hit that subscribe button. Because the stories we tell aren't just about what happened, they're about what happens next, and your voice helps shape that future.